Hello, we're going to read chapter 3, the second part of it, and we will get finished with this book before school is out. We just left off where they are traveling back to camp, and they're kind of playing a game, Zero and Stanley, about who will take the first drink of water. So one says, "I'm not thirsty," and the other one says, "I'm not thirsty either." Stanley smiled. "I'm a camel," he said. They walked for what seemed like a very long time and still never came across the Mary Lou, which, remember, is the boat that Zero hid behind, which the boat once belonged to Sam, the onion picker, who owned those onions and fell in love with Kissing Kate Barlow. So kind of going back in the story. Stanley was pretty sure they were heading in the right direction. He remembered that when they left the boat, they were headed toward the setting sun. Now they were headed toward the rising sun. He knew the sun didn't rise and set exactly in the east and west, more southeast and southwest, but he wasn't sure how that made a difference. His throat felt as if it was coated with sandpaper. "You sure you're not thirsty?" he asked. "Not me," said Zero. His voice was dry and raspy. When they did finally take a drink, they agreed to it at the same time. Zero, who was now carrying the sack, set it down and took out 2 jars, giving one to Stanley. They decided to save the canteen for last, since it couldn't accidentally break. "You know I'm not thirsty," Stanley said as he unscrewed the lid. "I'm just drinking so you will." "I'm just drinking so you will," said Zero. They clinked the jars together, and each watching the other poured the water into their stubborn mouths. Zero was the first to spot the Mary Lou, maybe a quarter mile away, and just a little off to the right. They headed for it. It wasn't even noon yet, and they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. "I don't know what happened to my mother," Zero said. "She left, and she never came back." Stanley peeled an onion. She couldn't always take me with her," Zero said. "Sometimes she had to do things by herself." Stanley had the feeling that Zero was explaining things to himself. "She'd tell me to wait in a certain place for her when I was real little. I had to wait in small areas, like on a porch step or a doorway. 'Now don't leave here until I get back,' she'd say. I never liked it when she left. I had a stuffed animal, a little giraffe, that I'd hug it the whole time she was gone. When I got bigger, I was allowed to stay in bigger areas, like stay on this block or don't leave the park. But even then, I still had Jaffy." Stanley guessed that Jaffy was the name of Zero's giraffe. "And then one day she didn't come back," Zero said. His voice sounded hollow. "I waited for her at Lanny Park." "Lanny Park?" said Stanley. "I've been there." "You know the playscape?" asked Zero. "Yeah, I played on it. I waited there for her more than a month," said Zero. "You know that tunnel that you crawl through between the slide and the swinging bridge? That's where I slept." And we know that Zero was homeless. We don't know why or how, but this is kind of the backstory. They ate 4 onions apiece and drank about half a jar of water. Stanley stood up and looked around. Everything looked the same in all directions. "When I left camp, I was heading straight toward Big Thumb," he said. "I saw the boat off to the right, so that means we have to turn a little to the left." Zero was lost in thought. "What? Okay," he said. They headed out. It was Stanley's turn to carry the sack. "Some kids had a birthday party," Zero said. "I guess it was about 2 weeks after my mother left. There was a picnic table next to the playscape with balloons tied to it. The kids looked to be about the same age as me. One girl said hi to me and asked me if I wanted to play. I wanted to, but I didn't. I knew I didn't belong at the party, even though it wasn't their playscape. There was this one mother who kept staring at me like I was some kind of monster. Then later a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake, but then that same mother told me, 'Go away,' and she told all the kids to stay away from me, so I never got that piece of cake. I ran away so fast I forgot Jaffy." "Did you find it? Find him?" For a moment Zero didn't answer, then he said, "He wasn't real." Stanley thought again about his own parents, how awful it would be for them to never know if he was dead or alive. He realized that was how Zero must have felt, not knowing what happened to his own mother. He wondered why Zero never mentioned his father. "Hold on," Zero said, stopping abruptly. "We're going the wrong way." "No, this is right," said Stanley. "We were heading toward Big Thumb when you saw the boat off to your right," said Zero. "That means we should have turned right when we left the boat." "You sure?" Zero drew a diagram in the dirt. We know that Zero's never been to school before, and at the beginning of the story didn't know how to read, but we also know he's very intelligent and very good at math. Stanley still wasn't sure. You need to go this way, Zero said, first drawing a line on the map and then heading that way himself. Stanley followed. It didn't feel right to him, Zero seemed sure. Sometime in the middle of the afternoon, a cloud drifted across the sky and blocked out the sun. It was a welcome relief. Once again, Stanley felt that destiny was on his side. Zero stopped and held out his arm to stop Stanley too. Listen, Zero whispered. Stanley didn't hear anything. They continued walking very quietly, and Stanley began to make out the faint sounds of Camp Green Lake. They were too far away to see the camp, but he could hear a blend of indistinct voices. As they got closer, he occasionally could hear Mr. Sir's distinctive bark. They walked slowly and quietly, aware that sounds travel in both directions. They approached a cluster of holes. Let's wait here until they go in, said Zero. Stanley nodded. He checked to make sure there was nothing living in it, and then climbed down into a hole. Zero climbed into the next one. Despite having gone the wrong way for a while, it hadn't taken them nearly as long as Stanley had expected. Now they just had to wait. The sun cut through the cloud, and Stanley felt its rays beating down on him, but soon more clouds filled the sky, shading Stanley and his hole. He waited until he was certain the last of the campers had finished for the day. Then he waited a little longer. As quietly as possible, he and Zero climbed up out of their holes and crept towards camp. Stanley held the sack in front of him, cradled in his arms instead of over his shoulder, to keep the jars from clanking against each other. A wave of terror rushed over him when he saw the compound, the tents, the rec room, the warden's cabin under the 2 oak trees. The fear made him dizzy. He took a breath, summoned his courage, and continued. That's the one, he whispered, pointing out the hole where they had found the gold tube. It was still about 50 yards away, but Stanley was pretty sure it was the right hole. There was no need to risk going any closer. They climbed down into adjacent holes and waited for the camp to fall asleep. Here ends chapter 43. We are currently on chapter 44, and we end at chapter 50. And we have about 30 pages left. So, something to look forward to. This is always one of my favorite stories every year. Have a good day, 4th graders.